painstaking effort to document pretty much every event that would prove significant in shaping popular music.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Purchase the book at www.rock'n'rollunraveled.com. Follow him at Twitter at R&R Unraveled, and look him up on Facebook at Rock'n'Roll Unraveled.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now. You're listening to the John Lebang Show.
It's hydroponic radio for your brain, man.
Feel smarter yet?
Somebody else who's operating on the side of mainstream success was Iggy Pop, and he went up against Kurt Cobain.
Yeah, and Kurt Cobain came out well on top there. But I mean, as frontmen go, and as someone who's going to generate interest on stage, I mean, Iggy Pop's your man. Absolutely amazing. He's another guy like Zappa who started out as a drummer with the Iguanas in the early 60s, and it was sort of late 60s where the psychedelic Stooges became the Stooges, and it was the very end of the 60s when the Stooges had their first album. So again, you know, you can see people who are working away for a very long time before they achieved a lot of success. And he's one of these guys that on both sides of the water, punk bands very much say is one of their big influences, Iggy Pop.
Yeah, and most of his success really came later on, after years of hearing the songs from the Stooges.
And it's interesting, though, it was the Stooges rather than Iggy Pop that were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I thought that was an interesting one when I noticed that. But I mean, one of the things that would have Iggy Pop in any poll like this for a frontman, it's got to be the gig he did on the 11th of August, 1974, when he was in a thing called the Murder of the Virgin, a sort of improvised play at the English Disco in LA. And during the performance, the guitarist James Williamson, Williamson was dressed in a Nazi uniform and was actually whipping Iggy Pop on stage. And then it climaxed with Iggy Pop slashing himself across the chest with a knife. I mean, absolutely incredible. And you got rumours before the gig circulating that Iggy Pop was actually going to kill himself on stage that night. That's a front man. He didn't actually kill himself, but that must have been one heck of a gig to have been at.
You know, some of these artists, things have to grow on people. Very much like David Bowie. David Bowie had more success than Iggy Pop, but it's in the same kind of vein of things.
I think what helped Iggy Pop along the way as well was the punk movement in the second half of the latter part of the 70s, because everybody claimed Iggy Pop as a major influence. Other people have often you see that people cite Iggy Pop as an influence, and I think that's one of the things that keeps Iggy Pop's reputation going.
Now, in our next matchup, we have Steve Marriott going up against the Man of Destiny, Freddie Mercury.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest trouncings of the whole thing. But I mean, Steve Marriott. I mean, what an interesting guy. I mean, he's been around since the beginning. In '63, he was in a group called the Frantics. For any Small Faces fans out there who want to go hunting some rare singles, he had a solo single out in 1963 called "Give Her My Regards," and apparently in 1964 he was in a band with Phil Collins called the Johnny B. Great and the Quotations.
That shows you how far back Phil Collins goes as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, most of these guys were around in the early 60s, and it's interesting that most of the people who were around in the first half of the 60s, in the sort of beat era, they never managed to transfer their success into the second half of the 60s, which was the rock era. If you look at the bands who did, it was the people who wrote their own material. So the people who were successful in the early 60s and the late 60s and beyond, you've got people like the Beatles, the Kinks, the Stones. It was very much the the songwriting bands that had success. I mean, it was the mid-'65 when the Small Faces came around. But like all good frontmen, he was a bit temperamental. And New Year's Eve '68, he stormed off the stage. Something obviously upset him when he was at Alexandra Palace in London. I mean, it wasn't the end of the band, the Small Faces. They did carry on, but they did split up shortly afterwards. And that was when Steve Marriott formed Humble Pie with Peter Frampton and Greg Ridley. And they're a great band. For anybody who's never come across Humble Pie, they've got some awesome rock and roll music. But he died now in 1991. But when he left the Small Faces, that was when the Small Faces became the Faces, and they replaced Marriott with Ron Wood and Rod Stewart. So they replaced, because he was the lead guitarist and lead vocalist in the Small Faces. And I mean, they are an awesome band. They were a mod band, very much the mid-'60s, mid-to-late '60s. Absolutely superb.
Now we move on to another, superb matchup. This one, I think, again, was another, it was a flip of a coin. And even though Jim Morrison looks like he routed Mick Jagger, I don't think it was as far apart as the numbers show.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And, I mean, Mick Jagger has been... I mean, he's one of the first real sort of front men, as you think of a front man in the band. He was one of the first, really, certainly of this era, to be strutting around the stage. Again, he'd been around since he had his own band, 1961, Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys, with Keith Richard and Dick Taylor, who went off to formed the Pretty Things, and they joined Brian Jones's second lineup in '62. And again, Alexis Corner pops up in a lot of these histories, because Mick Jagger was a regular lead singer with Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated. And by '63, early '63, the Classic Stones lineup was in place. But there was a sextet then, because they still had Ian Stewart, the pianist. And then from there, obviously, they had one heck of a career.
Yeah, and Rolling Stones never seemed to quit touring either.
They just tour regularly. I mean, they're back on tour now. Their No Filter tour finished, but now they've announced some American dates, and they're all stadia dates. 20th of April to the 21st of June. So if you're a Stones fan, check out the website and look out for when the tickets go on sale, because I'm pretty sure they'll go on sale very soon, and I'd have thought they will sell out very quickly.
Very quickly, and they're probably not going to be cheap.
Yeah, what I love about the Stones is they've had loads of albums, obviously, over the last few decades, and their first 2 or 3 albums were virtually all covers, and then they started doing all their own material. And in 2016, they released Blue and Lonesome. It was their first studio album for a decade, and it was all covers again. It was all blues and R&B covers. So it's great to see them go back to their roots. And I dare say the tours will tend to reflect this as well. Gives them an opportunity to put some more true blues and R&B songs into the repertoire. Brilliant.
What I found interesting about the Stones is that, at least with the fan base, they were like the anti-Beatles. You were either a Stones fan or you were a Beatles fan.
Absolutely. I know I was always in the Stones camp as a boy, as it were, because I always preferred my music with a slightly harder edge. And in fact, sort of partied with the Beatles around the sort of '63 era in preference for the Stones. But it was Sgt. Pepper that brought me back to the Beatles. That was when I started listening to the Beatles stuff again with any real interest. I mean, you listen to it now, and it's not of its era. You listen to most albums, and they fit nicely into the era they were recorded. But that's one of the things I think that makes the Beatles special. I mean, you can't really say very unique or unique, and there are other artists whose music is timeless. But there was just nothing like it at the time. Absolutely amazing.
So we have a very interesting next matchup. This is back to our boys in the Who. Now they're facing off against James Brown.
That's right. They lost out to James Brown quite convincingly.
Yeah, by 20 points. That's pretty convincingly.
Yeah.
This is where I would have liked to seen if Robert Plant would have done better against James Brown.
Yeah, he probably would, actually.
But the Who have had just what an amazing career.
Yeah, I mean, they started back in 1959. I mean, Entwistle and Townsend were in a band called the Confederates, which was a trad jazz band. Trad jazz was the British take on traditional New Orleans jazz. And John Entwistle played the trumpet and French horn, and Townsend played the banjo. A good start for them. Then, of course, they hooked up and finally became the Who. Keith Moon was the last piece of the jigsaw there. It wasn't until May '64 that he joined the band. And this story mirrors the Beatles in a lot of ways, because their original drummer, who'd been with the Who, or the Detours, as they called themselves most of that time, for about 2 years, was a guy called Doug Sandon. And they had their first audition with a guy from Fontana Records, and he liked the band but didn't like the drummer, in the same way George Martin liked the Beatles but didn't like Pete Best. So Pete Best left the Beatles and Ringo joined them. Doug Sandon left the Who, and Keith Moon joined them. So they had their second audition, and Fontana signed them. It was a single. Just one single at that particular time, but they went on to become, one of the greatest rock and roll bands in the world, I think.
And one of the few rock bands that came up with the rock opera.
Yeah, Tommy. I mean, it was interesting as well, because if you like, that's a sort of, you could argue it's a sort of intellectual, conceptual album. But throughout their career, up until that particular point, they were very much known as a singles band. And it's interesting that a singles band should actually then produce one of the first real conceptual albums. But I mean, awesome band to see live back in the days of Keith Moon. I mean, they really were awesome, and that's why I think having the three of them together, because they all epitomize what the group was all about.
They were one of the few groups that could come up with these rock operas, which are complete stories. I think that makes a band special. Yeah,
and they followed Tommy, of course, with Quadrophenia. I mean, they had a lot of problems, and they took it on the road, though, when they were promoting the album. The tour started in the UK. And I remember the first 2 or 3 gigs. The first gig, they had to use a lot of sound effects and tapes and stuff, and they were out of sync. They ended up dropping 2 or maybe 3 songs from the first gig to the second gig because they just weren't working. It was under-rehearsed, and that first part of the tour was an absolute nightmare.
And that finishes off the second round.
I think 1 or 2 surprises there, like the size of the James Brown win there. But what's really interesting is just how in so many of these cases people are working really hard for quite a while before they ever find commercial success or get to a wider audience.
Now we're moving on to the third round, which is the Elite Eight. And it gets really interesting, and the matchups now become really hard.
Yeah.
First one we're going to talk about, Prince defeats Elvis Presley.
That's right. And quite convincingly as well. I mean, Elvis is a fascinating guy. I mean, he's had 3 completely different careers. He was, 1950s, he was the face of rock and roll. He was the king of rock and roll. Then he went in the army, came out of the army, and Colonel Parker, his manager, decided that what he ought to do, he ought to become a film star. And the only albums and singles released should come from the movies. So throughout the 1960s, well, he had made a few in the 1950s, but throughout the 1960s,